fire up, but they set up and ambushed them on that sandbar, waiting for them to kind of get choked right there.
And by the time they reached the Marine lines, they were so already depleted anyway. Then they had to make a full-on assault against, defensive positions.
What's going on, everyone? Preston, Stewart, and Sayre Payne with War Stories, joined today by Dave Holland. Sir, thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh, thank you guys for having me on. It's an honor and a pleasure.
Yeah, this is going to be a lot of fun. So we're going to talk a little teaser, talk Guadalcanal during World War II, I think primarily. But Dave, you mind giving a quick background on yourself?
Yeah, I guess you can tell my accent's a bit of a bastardized accent. I've been in Australia for 27 years. I'm originally from Alabama. I've been in, once again, it said Australia for 28 years, I think. But I did 8 years in U.S. Marines, did embassy guard duty. That's how I become Australia initially. Married an Australian. In 95, moved back to Australia. I currently work for the Australian government. In 2009 was the first chance I got to go to Guadalcanal. You can imagine, as a former Marine and a military history nut, huge chance to go to Guadalcanal. So my first time to Guadalcanal through work, which is great because it's obviously a free paid trip, best way to do it. I spent 4 months there, so I was enough to, I guess, dip my foot in and get a bit of a teaser. I need to know more about this because 4 months isn't enough. I mean, guys that go over there for 1 week tours, I mean, they barely scratch the surface. Yeah. So that was 2009 and 10, and then 2011, 12, 13, I did a lot of short trips. 1 month here, maybe 2 weeks there. And during that time, I led a lot of tours because I was the go-to guy with the Australians. Also, there was, when I was there's Australian military commitment. Australians and New Zealanders had a military commitment under a program called Ramsey. So I led a number of battlefield study groups and battlefield study sessions for the NCOs and officers when I was there. And then in 2018, I got the opportunity to go for a 2-year deployment as an advisor to the Solomon Islands. So I was there from 2018 to 2020. So I thought this was a great opportunity now. Probably no one's ever got this opportunity, especially with the background I had and, the passion to really drill down on the Guadalcanal campaign, especially the land campaign. So in 2009, I met an Australian expat who lived there. His name was John Ennis, and unfortunately he's passed away, but John was the go-to guy for years because he lived there for almost 20 years. And John Ennis had the opportunity because a lot of these veterans would come back and John would take them around, and he was getting that secondhand or that firsthand information straight from the veterans. I mean, John got so detailed, he could take them straight to their fighting positions and fought. Wow. So they were telling their stories to John. And John, I learned a lot from John on that. Me and him in 2009, at that stage, he was retired. He used to come back to the battlefield. I spent a whole week with him, just one-on-one, walking around. And then he asked me to continue a lot of his stuff he never got around to. But I took a step further because I have that military background, which John didn't, and I could relate a lot of more things on the ground. So when I started doing my research, I said, well, I'd read something, and nothing, as you guys know, beats walking the ground. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I read this. Let's just see if it was true, and let's just see if that's correct, especially looking at the maps. To the majority of things, I found it was correct, but sometimes, as you guys know, it was a bit, this can't be what's written because whoever wrote this never walked the ground. So, and when I was over there for 2 years, I thought, well, how can I record this once again for people who never get the chance to go to Guadalcanal, or if they did go to Guadalcanal, like I mentioned earlier, they'd go for the 1 week tours, which hits some of the main points like Alligator Creek and Bloody Ridge and Tulagi and a few other points, which is main points of the campaign. But what can you cover in a week? You can't cover it all. And so I made a series of videos, and I'm still making the videos for those people. And my videos aren't made for entertainment unless you're really military nut and you go, oh, I love this, but it's educational, not entertainment. One of the guys in the comments basically said it's a pure history with no frills. I said, yeah, I guess, because I don't have a technological background. I had an iPhone 7, and I walked around. I filmed it on an iPhone 7, and then I edited on the iPhone 7, and then I uploaded on the Solomon Island internet. But yeah, they did have internet. Yeah, so you can imagine what difficulties I had, and I'm still making these videos, but I'm planning on going back to Guadalcanal. Either hopefully will work, if not privately, and do some more videos. And also run a Facebook site that kind of goes along with the YouTube, and I update that every day or two, and I try to provide I guess original material on there, and a lot of then and now photos. And when I was on Guadalcanal too, I led a lot of tours over there. And I still to this day, I assist a lot of authors and people who just want to know about Guadalcanal, especially since I've started my Facebook site. I get a lot of veterans relatives contact me. They said, oh, my father, my grandfather, my uncle, whatever, served in Guadalcanal. Can you help me? And if I can find out what their unit was, I can basically narrow it down and even show them photos of then and now and help them out, which I don't mind doing. I really love that. It's like a good service I can do.
Yeah, that's awesome.
We'll definitely link the Facebook group and those videos so people can look those up, because I have a feeling we're going to get into some things and it'll be good to actually have a visual to it. But so I'm glad you described the Alabama, Australia accent, because otherwise it's racking my brain trying to figure out what is that? What am I getting?
Yeah, me too. Yeah, and now it makes sense. It all makes sense.
Well, I had one person made a comment too, and they said, are you from Adelaide or are you from Alabama? And I said, well, when I get excited in some of my videos, the old hillbilly accent, because I come from Appalachian Mountains and around Anniston and Piedmont and Northeast Alabama, that pops out sometimes. But I've been here in Australia so long, I forget what is American slang and what's Australian slang. This does my head in. So it does my head in. I think that's Australian. So that's
not here. Yeah.
It does my head in. That's Australian.
So you hit on it already, but I mean, Guadalcanal is a bucket list item for me to visit, and for a lot of other people, but it's daunting to get there. And the idea of going there for, you said a week, I've always had in my mind that I'd hate to go there for 2 or 3 days, but you're right. Even a week, I feel like you wouldn't be able to get everything that you really wanted to, but it's still not even that close for you. It's closer, but you're still 1,000 miles from Guadalcanal at least.
Well, I live in Canberra. Yeah, it's even a bit further, but it's not as daunting as you would think. Like obviously comparing like Peleliu and even Tarawa Basio. Currently, Guadalcanal is closed off to tourists. I understand the latest I heard in end of July of this year, it's going to open up. So it's the 80th anniversary this year too. So I hope it does open up.
Was that a COVID?
Yeah, it's a COVID hit the islands quite later than the rest of the world. I mean, they held it off for a good year and a half, I think. And then it hit, and they basically closed it down for outside tourists. But the way that most Americans would come over, especially in your week-long tour groups or individual, they would leave US from the West Coast, and they'd fly into Nandi, Fiji. And from Nandi, Fiji, they'd take Fiji Air and straight into Honiara, which is the capital city. And it's a fairly straightforward shot. You only have 2 stops if you're leaving from the West Coast. So the Nandi, sometimes they'd stay a night over in Nandi, or they'd just take off again. I had my best friend, he's a retired U.S. Army colonel. He visited me over there. I knew him since first grade. Me and him met at a table drawing, I think we're drawing airplane pictures in the first grade.
There we go.
I've known him ever since. I've corresponded him ever since. He's a retired U.S. Army colonel, but he lives in Texas, and he come visit me. I said, come over. It took him 44 hours. But saying that, I think he took, a few different flights from Texas, and he did a layover for like so many hours in LA. But it's not that daunting. I mean, you're not flying in and jumping on a banana boat and, doing other things at some of these islands.
So
hopefully it opens up.
I'll ask a question. You think about it while I give a little background for anybody who doesn't know Guadalcanal, and then I'm expecting some corrections here, hopefully. But so the question is going to be, where do you start to take people on these tours? What are the key places that are so worth seeing on the ground that are hard to get a grasp of from a video or from reading? But while you're thinking about that for a second, Guadalcanal, for anybody not familiar, was the first major land offensive in the Pacific for the United States in World War II. So it would have been in August of 42?
Yes.
August 42. So Pearl Harbor, December of 41. So think about that. I feel like personally, I always lose track of time. We're 2 months into the war in Ukraine, and it feels like it's been going on forever. The first major ground offensive 9 months after Pearl Harbor almost. But it ended up going on for 6-ish months, I think. Yes. A lot of pretty heavy fighting at the beginning. But massive island, very, very large island compared to other islands the U.S. and the Allies would take throughout the Pacific. But a lot of history there. It was a point in the war where it wasn't clear that the Allies were actually going to be able to push the Japanese back. So everybody was kind of watching it on pins and needles. There was a real chance the U.S. could get pushed off that island entirely. But that said, any corrections, please add them in there or things we need to know. But what are some good spots?
Well, the ones that they mainly hit on the itinerary you'll see on the week-long tours, it's what you would think. Obviously, Alligator Creek, Bala-Ilu River, the Pacific series on HBO pictured it quite well. That was a night scene. I think all the combat on Guadalcanal in that series were all night because it was night attacks. But that was the one at the sandbar, if you remember, at the river. When you got Bob Lakey and the Japanese are attacking off across the sandbar, that's a go-to, and then that's not far from the airport. Most of these are very easy to visit because the Guadalcanal campaign, and you mentioned it there, the island's quite large. It's 90 miles long and about 25 miles wide. But the majority of the fighting, happened probably in about I'd say 15-mile stretch along the coast and in some of the ridges. It basically from around Point Cruz, which is downtown Honiara, to a little bit past Henderson Field, which is now Honiara International Airport. Because if you fly into Honiara International Airport, you're flying on Henderson Field. Henderson, World War II, you're flying straight on top of it. Well, a little bit to the side, but yeah, you're flying on the same. They've just extended the runway for modern jets. So as soon as you land, you're right on a history area. So yeah, so you got Alligator Creek, Bloody Ridge, or Edson's Ridge. I like Edson's Ridge, but a lot of people call it Bloody Ridge, referred to. Nowadays, it's called Bloody Ridge. It's actually a peace park. It's the only national park in Honiara or Solomon Islands, because Solomon Islands is a number of islands in the outside country. In Tulagi, one day they take a boat and they go across Iron Bottom Sound. It's about 20 miles away to Tulagi. Now, Tulagi was the scene of the first real fight the Marines had on August the 7th. August the 7th, the Marines came in. They had a task force. They divided into two. So Vandergrift, who was the division commander of the 1st Marine Division, he took about 11,000 Marines and landed on Beach Red on Guadalcanal. And then General Rupertus, who was the assistant division commander, brigadier general, he took about 6,000 Marines to assault Gavutu, Tanambogo, and in Tulagi, which is 3 small islands, right off Florida Islands, which is about 20 miles north of Guadalcanal. And that was the first hard fight they had. That's why they sent the best trained Marines over there. So you had the 1st Raider Battalion, 1st Paratrooper Battalion, and you had the 2nd Battalion, the 5th Marines, and they were the probably the highest rated battalions because they knew they were in for a fight. And the fight they had there from August the 7th and 8th and 9th set the stage of how the rest of the Pacific was going to go, because they had to dig these Japanese out of caves. Japanese basically fought to the last man. And they were going against especially in Tulagi, the 3rd Kuri Special Naval Landing Force, the Japanese naval infantry, or sometimes they're referred to them as Japanese Marines in some circles, but not as we as the Western Marines, like the U.S. Marines or the British Royal Marines.
Is that fight on Tulagi? Would you say that's really like the first time the U.S. went head to head with the Japanese? I know there's been fighting all across the Pacific, but the information coming off Tulagi is going to be used at Guadalcanal, where some of these other fights like Wake Island or in the Philippines, that information is kind of segmented because they're being overrun.
And also, too, this was the first time that at that stage, Guadalcanal was the first offensive. And in day one, August 7th, the Marines were on the offensive. So that was the first stage of where the Japanese were on the defensive there, because they were dug into we had to take an island. So they were dug in. Before, we wouldn't take an island. We were on the defense. So the Japanese, say, for example, at Wake, they were assaulting. The Philippines, they were assaulting. Malaya, they were assaulting. Dutch Indies, they were assaulting. But the Guadalcanal campaign, even though it was a first offensive, it turned into a quick defensive, because once the U.S. took the airfield and ran the Japanese away, then they went into defensive posture. And then the rest of the campaign was basically fought. Vandergrift, he probably ran a number of active defense, I would say. So he did limited offenses just to push the Japanese back to gain, to get them away from the perimeter of the airfield. Because, the Henderson airfield at that stage was probably, arguably the most important real estate in the whole Pacific. Well, I guarantee the most in the South Pacific. It was, it was the unsinkable aircraft carrier. The Pacific wasn't the Europe was more of a land war, and you had the air and the Navy supporting the land war. You can reverse, like Ian told the author, basically says, and I agree with him, the Pacific War was mainly air and naval, and you had the infantry or the ground supporting the naval and air campaign, because you think about it.
Yeah. I haven't heard it put that way.
Reverse from the Europe to the Pacific, because, it was a series of, taking the islands, holding the islands. There was advanced bases, so we could put aircraft on there to just keep advancing up. So it was just up the ladder, whether you went to the Southwest Pacific or, for Nimitz through the Central Pacific, the two axis approach the Allies had. But also, you go back to the original question. So yeah, Tulagi is a place to visit, Alligator Creek, Bloody Ridge, and then the points, the Mount Austin, which is where the Army jumped in, especially in the Army offenses, starting in December and January, the Mount Austin area. I know you guys are former Army guys, so remind me, and I will get to talk about the Army, because the Army is basically left out in Guadalcanal.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to, rectify that a bit. So the Mount Austin area they cover, but the area that's not covered is the scene of the most intensive and prolonged fighting on Guadalcanal. And that's the Matanical River line and the Point Cruz line, which is downtown Honeyard. That hardly ever gets visited. I mean, there was one tour group, I was there, and there were a tour group from the States. And I was talking to a lady, and her dad was actually fought with the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. And we were sitting in an area where a yacht club was, having the drinks after a night of touring. And she wasn't in my group, but she said, she's herself, she's a retired Marine colonel. And I'd met her at the memorial service in morning 4. And I said, how's the trip going? She goes, yeah. She goes, I still can't find out where my father was. And I said, well, just tell me, exactly who he was or what unit and where. And she said, she told me. And I said, well, where you're setting it? She goes, no. She said, I was told by the tour guides that nothing really happened in this area. I said, okay, well, I said, over there was one where one Medal of Honor was earned. Over there was another Medal of Honor, and over here, the Medal of Honor. And your father was actually wounded in this area, within eyesight of where you've been sleeping. Your father was wounded. And later on, she sent me a letter that, her father was hit in the back of the head. And that was, but that was in the Point Cruz area. And that Point Cruz line, I mean, if you go there now and you stay in the main hotels of Guadalcanal, the Western hotels, you're staying right on the battlefield. If you look in some of my videos, especially the Little Dunkirk action involving the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, they were cut out and wiped out. That was where Monroe, the only U.S. Coast Guardman, earned the Medal of Honor. He earned it there. You had the Point Cruz line, which was the Army and the Marines fought, from November all the way up until January. That was a Point Cruz line. They were in there for almost 2 months, and up and down those ravines fighting. And that's left out of most histories, because most histories and the 1st Marine Division basically, they carried the hard yards in Guadalcanal. I mean, they were there for 4 months, and when they were, the medical professionals at the time said, a unit like that could maybe last 6 weeks at the most in those type of conditions, but they lasted 4 months. And the other one, the first reinforcement they received, other than the 7th Marines, was a 164th U.S. Army unit, and that was in October the 12th.
National Guard.
Great unit too, by the way. They call themselves the 164th Marines. And Puller basically said about the 164th, he said, oh, these farm boys can fight because they were from North Dakota and South Dakota and some from Wisconsin. And National Guard unit, they came in and, they were thrown in that night on the Battle of Henderson Field.
David,
with rest.
I was going to say, think how tough those guys were. All of them in general, right? All of them in general. But that area, Great Depression, I mean, that was their coming of age. In certain parts of America, for sure, it was like real bad poverty, and you'd have to be real tough to be able to survive. And to think that then they came of age and it really came as an adult, right smack dab into a place like this. Because what it sounds like, this active defense is like it almost sounds like trench warfare in a way, with these stalemates that they were going, which is, as we think World War I is obviously just horrendous.
Yes. Yeah, they once both forces operating at the end of their supply lines. I mean, Guadalcanal is a great campaign to study nowadays. I mean, especially nowadays with the current posture in the Pacific. But I know the U.S. forces and their peer opponents do study Guadalcanal campaign, that multi-dimensional campaign with the sea, air, and land. I mean, Guadalcanal was probably the only time in the Pacific War the forces were roughly evenly matched. If you think about it, with the before Guadalcanal, I mean, the Allies getting pushed back and they were a bit, being overwhelmed. But after the later campaigns in late 43, 44, and 45, I mean, the Allies just overwhelmed the Japanese. But the Japanese are still on the offensive during the Guadalcanal campaign. And we talk about Midway, and some of the great historians say Midway wasn't the turning point a lot of people think it was. So what's a turning point in a war, you think? What would you define as a turning point of a war?
I mean, I think that's the challenge, right? Each person gets to decide. It could be a shift in equipment, could be a shift in momentum, a stopping of an offensive, maybe the start of an offensive.
Well, yeah, I mean, there is probably not one turning point. There's a whole number of things to be a turning point. But to me, probably to define a turning point in a war is a strategic shift of momentum, not a tactical shift, but at that strategic level, strategic shift of momentum. So after Midway, the Japanese had a bit of a setback. I mean, they lost, the 4 large aircraft carriers, but, they were still outnumbered the American Navy at that stage. They still had a number of their carrier pilots, and they had a setback. But what that setback allowed the U.S., there was a small stall in the momentum of the Japanese that allowed the U.S. to say, okay, let's just bring our plans forward. But they had plans anyway, like Admiral King had plans to take Tulagi and go on a limited offensive in the Southwest Pacific. But it just accelerated the plans, because of when the 1st Marine Division left the U.S., they went to New Zealand, to garrison New Zealand, and also to train up for 6 months. They told they would be the main unit to start the fight back. But Vandegrift was said, well, okay, you got 6 months to train your guys up, and they were looking at early February 43. And the Japanese thought the same. Americans won't go on offensive. But King, being King, it was the whole Joint Chief of Staff basically said, look, it's going to be European first. That's all our resources going. We're just going on the defensive in the Pacific. And King said, well, we're going to go on a limited offensive in small bits. He was given the permission, but that accelerated it. So after the Battle of Guadalcanal, and being Australian, like I said, I got Australian American, I got my foot in both doors. You hear a lot of historians talk about, Guadalcanal was the turning point because that was the strategic shift. But they failed to mention the Buna, Gona, and Kokoda campaign at the same time. Because you got to remember the Buna and Gona, the Kokoda campaign with the Americans and the Australians, you had the 32nd Infantry Division, the U.S. in there, National Guard guys. But they fought at Buna Gona, which is the north coast of New Guinea, and they ended that campaign in January 43. And then the Guadalcanal campaign ended early February 43. But that was, I call it the 1-2 punch. So those major setbacks the Japanese had at Guadalcanal and Papua New Guinea with the Buna Gona was the turning point, because the strategic shifted after that. Because no time, if you don't count China, Burma, India, no time after that, Japanese were ever on the offensive. But right after Midway, the Japanese were surely on the offensive because they were pushing straight. They were still on the offensive in New Guinea. They were going. Their plans was to push further on down to the Solomons and use Tulagi and Guadalcanal as a staging base to proceed further down into like New Caledonia, Fiji, and possibly up into Samoa. They wanted to cut that vital supply line to Australia, and and hopefully cut Australia off, and hopefully push Australia for a separate peace and come to terms. But yeah, that's the strategic shift.
One of the things that's interesting to me in the Pacific theater is that every single campaign, maybe island, has its own unique flavor. There's something different about each one that makes it stand out. And to me, at least, when it comes to Guadalcanal, it's that there was no clear victory for a while there. There's later islands in the Pacific where victory's assured. It's just going to be a matter of at what cost. Iwo Jima is a good example. Iwo Jima was going to be taken. It's just at what cost. I say was going to be taken because Japan had no real ability to strike back. They really couldn't reinforce the island. They couldn't evacuate the island. But at Guadalcanal, Japan is reinforcing the island. The Americans are having a hard time reinforcing, or at least don't have total air and naval superiority by any stretch. If I'm not mistaken, the Marines on the beaches the Marines on land were being shelled by naval warships at times.
Almost
Japanese naval warships, right?
Well, yeah, and I still can't find anywhere else in U.S. military history that a group of U.S. military personnel was shelled so much by naval gunfire. I mean, what the Japanese would do, as you know, once the Marines and the Army, the Cactus Air Force, once it became established, they controlled the sea lanes during the day. And the Japanese, they shifted. Then, they shifted at night. The Japanese would drop their supplies off at night by the fast destroyer transports. And when they'd come through, they'd drop the troops and supplies off. And on the way out, they'd go, okay, and they'd throw a few 5-inchers into the perimeter and book out. But it wasn't until October the 13th to 14th, they call it the Night of the Battleships or the Bombardment. It's known throughout the Guadalcanal history as bombardment, where they wanted to bring the majority of the transports and tanks and large heavy guns. They wanted to do it because at night, what they used to do, they used to come in the fast destroyers and the barges, and they'd come in at night and drop them off. But the Japanese wanted to do a major push in October, and they wanted to bring a whole 2nd Division in with their heavy artillery and their tanks. And the only way they could do that was by transports. Transports was too slow to get in and out by night. So they said, we have to neutralize this airfield. So Yamamoto come up with a plan. So when they started out, they come out with the largest naval group they had since Midway. And they come down and they took 2 battleships and they bombarded the airfield, right, over one night. And they fired almost 1,000 14-inch rounds at that whole perimeter. And it's amazing. Only 40-something Marines died, and a lot of those guys were from the air pods. But it basically demolished the airfield. It wiped out almost every airplane they had. And then the next day, they scrounged around a few airplanes and had to go around and find some avgas, because they had the avgas. They separated them all around the perimeter, so they go find those. But it allowed the Japanese to bring those transports in and unload them, and the Marines could see them unloading. Nothing they can do about it. And they were unloading all the heavy guns, which is the pistol Petes. They were later called, the 150s and the 100 millimeter howitzers, big guns, and a whole company of Japanese tanks. They unloaded, and a few thousand Japanese infantrymen. And then the next night, they repeated it, but not with the 14-inchers, but they hit them with almost 900 or 800 8-inch and 5-inch rounds. And then the next night, they hit them with 5-inch and 8-inch rounds again, just smashing them to try to neutralize that airfield. And then in November, they tried to replicate that again. And then that was the American battleship on battleship action in the naval battles of Guadalcanal. And it goes back to what you mentioned before. It wasn't until probably the end of November that the matter was settled, that, okay, we're probably going to win this. Especially in October. I mean, MacArthur was even saying all the Marines are going to get wiped out there. He wasn't going to commit any more offensive actions, because he thought the Marines were going to get wiped out. And it wasn't a change. It wasn't until a change of high command, when Nimitz replace. There was an admiral called Gormley. Gormley was the admiral that ran it, and he never visited Guadalcanal, and he had a bit of a defeatist attitude, and when Nimitz visited the island, Nimitz actually flew into Guadalcanal, almost died. Actually, he flew in a B-17 and then almost didn't make it off the airfield, almost crashed into the tree. But he was subjected to naval bombardment too, and he told Vandergrift, he goes, "What do you need?" He says, "Give me anything you got, and just I can hold if you just give me some more reinforcements." So that was when you seen Gormley was replaced by Bull Halsey. And apparently as soon as the word got to the Marines that Halsey was going to replace, had been replaced, or Gormley had been replaced by Halsey, there was a big cheer went up. I think Halsey said something. They said, "Oh, you're in charge now." He said, "Oh, this is the hottest potato they ever handed me," when they gave it to him. But he took charge. He's a very aggressive commander. He goes, "Okay, I'll give you what you need." And that's when they sent the 164th. I'll send you some Army guys. It's, these guys are New Caledonia from the Maricao Division at the time. I'll send you these 164th in. And that was the October the 12th. And those poor 164th guys, as soon as they landed on the night of October the 12th. And, the 13th they landed, I think. But that was the night of the bombardment. That was the first, they're only there a few hours. And they said, once they got smashed, one of the Army guys said to the Marines, he goes, "Is this like this all the time?" He goes, "No, man, this ain't like this all the time."
Welcome to Guadalcanal.
Yeah. How were they fortified? Did they have, there's obviously sand there. Were they using sandbags, foxholes? Like, what were they doing? Because they did have a defensive position at the same time. So how are they protecting from all this bombardment that was going on?
As you know, they dug in deep. So that small fighting position. So on August the 9th, you're probably doing your reading that, the Navy pulled out and left a lot of the supplies on the transports when they had to pull out due to the Battle of Savo Island, which is what the largest, probably greatest defeat in U.S. Navy history, not counting Pearl Harbor. But reading the reports, for example, only 18 spools of barbed wire were offloaded, 18 spools. This is for a whole division. So they had basically a 15-mile perimeter. And at that stage, Vandergrift didn't have enough troops, so you had a horseshoe-shaped perimeter. And so they didn't have any concrete, no reinforcing bars, they didn't have anything like that. So basically they dug holes in. The sandbags they used was when they went through the Japanese camps, the Japanese construction camps that were building that airfield, they had a lot of rice bags. And you'll see in some of the pictures of Guadalcanal, you'll see these Hessian rice bags, and you'll see them on the floors of the Marines' tents. But they use these Hessian rice bags as sandbags. So they dug in, they sandbagged it, and they cut coconut trees down, because that whole area pre-war was the Lever Brothers coconut plantations. That's when you see the pictures of Guadalcanal, contemporary pictures. They're all coconut plantations. They're all coconut trees everywhere. So, they just cut coconut trees down and these coconut log reinforced bunkers they dug down. And like the coral ridges, you'll see in some of my videos and contemporary photos also, the ridges at Guadalcanal are barren. That's not because of deforestation. It was because I've been told that they're all coral and not much topsoil, so the trees don't grow on them. But the jungle underneath in the ravines is real thick jungle, but you can't really dig in on that coral either. You go up the Bloody Ridge, and those guys are basically doing the old what do you call them, the ranger graves or ranger scrapes. They're only 12 or 13 inches down. What do you guys call them? The ranger grave?
I think it's a ranger grave, just a real shallow one. Yeah,
you can't really scrape down too much. It's just a little shallow fighting position.
They're just hanging out. There's really nothing they can do if it's coral. That's just rock pretty much.
Yeah, and then it's shrapnel too. Once a good
and the same thing with the trees. It's like, I'm sure, because I think Bastogne too. Shelling, think a lot of Bastogne and all that, and it's like trees. I'm sure people were saved because of the trees in front of them, but I'm sure plenty of people were killed because of trees too, splintering and going off in all sorts of directions.
I seen a thing not too long ago in a documentary, and it showed like one of the wooden ships, and they were showing what it replicating and fired a cannonball into it. You've seen that one?
No, I imagine what that looks like.
Dan Snow history hit. Yeah, it's just a short video on his history hits, and they put a wall up with a planking the same replicated the thickness of an 18th century warship. Then they hit it with a cannonball and you could see the splinters fly on the other side. I was like, oh, yeah. But yeah, they dug in. And a thing on the Alligator Creek, which you were talking about defensive positions, and you guys would probably appreciate this. There's a story. It was only 18 spools of barbed wire got off the transports. So Battle of Alligator Creek was fought basically the night of the 21st of August. So the 2nd Battalion of the 1st Marines, their G Company was on that flank, right? And that sandbar, there was a pre-war coastal track or government track. It was basically a small track that it serviced the coconut plantations, and it served, a few of the villages in there. But because before the battles, there was hardly anyone living there other than the coconut workers and some villages. But there was no bridge across Elu River or Alligator Creek. So Elu River is like a tidal creek. You can see it on my videos. And there's a sandbar, and the sandbar, that was their access across the river. So the only way the Japanese could cross was that sandbar. So one enterprising private was looking around when they were digging in. He went to his platoon commander and he said, "Hey, sir," he says, "I see a lot of this. There's some barbed wire strands around these coconut plantations that, pre-war they used to use the cattle to, limit the vegetation there for the coconut plantation." And he goes, "Can I rip some of that barbed wire off? We'll put it over the sand spit, or the sandbar." And he goes, "That's a good idea. Private, go get it done." So they went, and the day before they put one strand of that civilian barbed wire over the sandbar. Probably, I don't know how high it was. I imagine it's probably about knee high or something.
Yeah.
So when the Japanese came through that night, the Chiki detachment, that was their first guys, their 28th Regiment, when they pushed through in that first wave across the sandbar, all bunched up, the Marines could hear them coming because the outpost, you could hear them. They pulled their outposts on the river, and they said, here they come. They're waiting on them. And then they heard this screaming and yelling and carrying on. And what happened was the first Japanese hit this barbed wire and it stopped. So if you guys been on a pack march before, the accordion effect, huh? Sure. You're marching. All of a sudden you're in the back and you stop and you hit the guy in front of you. And you go, what the hell just happened? And as soon as they hit that barbed wire, they didn't know what was happening. And then that's when the 37 millimeter anti-tank gun with those canister rounds of about 128 buckshot sized pellet just initiated the ambush, so to speak, with the 50 cals. But that, I thought that was I think his name lost to history. It just says the private, but I thought, man, he should have get a good award for that.
So they not only put the wire up, but they set up an ambush then on that sandbar, waiting for them to kind of get choked right there.
Yeah, well, it was there's a natural avenue of approach.
Yeah.
And you'll notice in my John Basilone videos and things like that, when that line that Basilone was on was in the thick jungle. And what the Marines used to do was, Basilone in his statement said that he could only see about 20 yards on the other side of the barbed wire line. The barbed wire line is about 30 feet from him. So, they're limited to what they can see. But what the Marines used to do, because, the Japanese did the infiltration tactics. That's the way they attacked. It's like, maneuver warfare. You pour water down a way. Well, it's explained to me when I was a young corporal in 89. Basically, you pour water down a hill, and what happens? It seeks the path of least resistance. It goes around the obstacle. That's what they did. They used to infiltrate at night and do that. But so the Japanese would, especially going through that thick jungle, you believe me, I've walked in that thick jungle, and I've walked it at night before and walked it 100 meters, and I could take 200 men, put them in that thick jungle and say, go to the other side. And you only give them 100 meters and they'd be all dispersed. I guarantee it. So unit cohesion just falls apart. So they take the path of least resistance. So that's why those battles are going down tracks and trails. So what the Marines would do, they'd cut their firing lines in, and they'd cut them at an angle. They'd cut them to 75 to 100 yards into the jungle. So these Japanese thick jungle at night trying to find a path of least resistance. As soon as they hit it, they went into those kill zones of firing lines. And, the Marines in there, they were in their bunkers, coconut log bunkers covered up, and they had those 30 cal heavy machine guns and the 30 cal light machine guns. As setting up machine guns, they just had them in their tripod, and they had them locked in. The only thing they had to do was pull the trigger, and you just hit straight in there. And they were just putting them in those firing lines. So that's what they do. They just funnel them into, just like, setting up an ambush, you just funnel them into that kill zone.
Yeah. And being in a file is the absolute worst formation to be in.
Oh yeah, they were
incoming rounds from a machine. I mean, that is the one you don't want to be in, but the terrain forced them to it.
Well, the Japanese, I mean, their tactics wasn't that great, especially their planning was good on Guadalcanal because they were on the offensive. They didn't do really bonsai charges. Their bonsai charges, and later in the war, were more like last ditch defensive measures. Nothing else. Oh, let's go. But they were doing trying to coordinate their assaults. They were doing on the offense. And in fact, at Coffin Corner, you'll see my videos in October the 24th to the 27th. I think I can't find any other places in the rest of the Pacific campaign. That was the last offensive charge or last offensive attack the Japanese did in the Pacific War. And the first night, that was where the John Basilone and the 1st Battalion 7th Marines, and then also the 3rd Battalion of the 164th was fed in with those guys. That's where they held off the Japanese. And then the next night, the Japanese did a major assault, a place called the Jeep Track at Coffin Corner, and that was when they reconsolidated the lines. The Basilone and Puller's battalion moved up on Bloody Ridge, and then the 3rd Battalion, the 164th, moved in, and it linked in with the 2nd Battalion. So that was, and they left the Marines left their heavy weapons there, but they funneled them in a place called the Jeep Track. And there, I mean, I've got all the fire support plans and everything. You had 237 millimeters on both sides of this Jeep trail. Then you had 50 cals, then you had 30 cals, and they're all in log covered bunkers. And the Japanese they said when they heard them coming the first time, they were smoking and they were walking in a file down the line, and they didn't have advanced scouts out. And, and wow. they said they were gibbering and jabbering and smoking and carrying on. And they thought they said the way they were walking, they were in like an admin march down a track. Didn't have an advanced scouts out, and they got hit. And then they realized, okay, this is the main line.
No idea.
And then the Marines had pre-registered fire. The artillery really really paid in its dividends for the Marines on Guadalcanal, especially the Battle of Edson's Ridge. I mean, the Marines had the 11th Marines, which is an artillery regiment. They had 5 battalions. They managed to initially bring in 4 battalions to Guadalcanal. So they had 3 battalions of the 75 millimeters, which the old French 75s, because still World War I weapons. And they had the newer 105s. That was one of the modern 105s. They had 155s battalion, but they left them in New Zealand due to the prime movers and the weight. Because when they combat loaded, to ship to invade Guadalcanal, they only can take so much. And they said, well, we have to leave the 155s back. And that later, when those Japanese offloaded those larger weapons, like the 100 millimeters and 150s, if you read some accounts of Guadalcanal, they call them a pistol Pete. Well, pistol Pete wasn't a singular gun. It was a name for any artillery really that opened up on the Marine perimeter. But they unloaded them. And then the Marines didn't have any method of counter battery fire,
sure,
because they had the 105s, and the 155s outdistanced them. So, for a while there, it was, we need to get some 155s. And finally, the 155s did arrive, I think late October, early November. Then the U.S. Army 155s arrived. And by the time the 25th Infantry Division got there in December, I mean, they had heaps of artillery that they used.
You mentioned earlier, but were they using that canister shot with the 105s?
No, they never did any direct fire with them or with the 75s. But like on the Battle of Bloody Ridge over 2 nights, I mean, they pre-registered. They brought a 75 millimeter battery right up to the right behind the hill. Then they had the 105 battalion basically at the airfield, which is only 1,500 meters away. And the Japanese basically said after. Well, the Japanese diaries, officers, captured diaries said the Marines were using automatic cannons because they were just, Pedro de Val, which was he was a brigadier general at the time. No, he's a colonel. He later from a brigadier general. He was the regimental colonel of the artillery. He came up and pre-registered a lot of them himself with Edson, which was the battalion commander of the Raiders. And they just opened up, they just dropped them in there. And when you go there to this day, you can just see there's shrapnel everywhere in that area. Look, to me, I think one of my videos of walking across it, it reminded me of walking across like a field firing range. You know, you're walking across an artillery field firing range or bombing range. It's just stuff everywhere.
I mean, it does sound World War I like, you know, it really does. I mean, the more you're describing it with that hard lines being moving by inches almost, stalemates, artilleries, hunkering down, not really moving, but just constantly fighting at the same time.
Well, the Marines had a linear defense too. They didn't have enough Marines to go to the defense in depth, which is a lot of the defense in depth, as you know, in World War I. That's what they did. And it was a number of World War I vets in the 1st Marine Division at the time. I mean, the 1st Marine Division at that time was the who's who of the Marine Corps. You know, because the 2nd Marine Division, but you look who was in the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal. It was, you know, it was like we're bringing out our all-star team.
Sure.
You know, the legends, so to speak.
So then what was it? If that's an interesting thought, if we're bringing our all-star team A game in to get the foothold in Guadalcanal, what was the disposition of the Marine or the Japanese? I mean, are these guys veterans of some other Japanese campaign prior? Are these fresh recruits? Are they motivated? Are they scared? Are they confident? Like, what's going on with them?
Yeah, good question. Japanese sent their best to Guadalcanal. Because Guadalcanal, especially after they did 3 major assaults on Guadalcanal. They did the first one at Alligator Creek on the 21st of August, and they used a reinforced battalion. And that reinforced battalion they used was the Ichiki detachment of the 28th Regiment. Their 28th Regiment was reported to be one of their best assault units. In fact, they were the ones slated to invade Midway. You know, they were on the transport. And Colonel Ichiki was one of their best commanders. I mean, he was one that actually is a major, initiated the Marco Polo incident in 37. It started the whole thing off. But he was instructor through infantry school. He was a very well-renowned guy. He'd written some manuals and things. So he was a regimental colonel. So I think they were in Truck. They had been at Guam. They were at Truck or Guam at the time. They were getting orders. Obviously, they didn't invade Midway, and they were getting orders to go back to Tokyo. And they said, "Oh, we got some Marines there." We thought the Japanese thought it was a raid. You know, they'll come in and go out, or just they underestimated the number of Marines. I thought only 2,000. So they sent Ichiki there on fast destroyers, so they landed, and that was one of the best units. And you know, Alligator Creek, Ichiki didn't wait. He was giving orders either make an assessment, attack, push these guys out, or wait for your second echelon, which he didn't wait. And, you know, they almost got wiped out to the man. But the 28th was one of the best units. And then the 35th Brigade under Kawaguchi was another good unit. And all these guys were veterans of, say, the Java and Dutch East Indies. And they were part of South Sea. They fought through there.
They've got some wins under their belt, plenty of wins.
Oh, yeah. These guys are veterans too. And, you know, and then once they lost at Battle of Bloody Ridge, and that was the second attack, and it was a brigade size. And the last attack was a reinforced division size. And that division was the 2nd Sendai Division, which was one of the best units they had too. And then, say, for example, then they had the 38th, most of the 38th Division fought on Guadalcanal too. And the 230th Regiment was one of the best units. I mean, they were the guys that took Hong Kong. So they went from Hong Kong. Then after they invaded Hong Kong, they went, that 230th. Then they went into the Dutch East Indies. They led the assaults there. So to answer your original questions, it was their A team also, especially their carrier, their air crews were their A team. So that was all naval air. So at the Solomon Islands campaign destroyed the Japanese. It wasn't Midway. It was the Japanese. It was the 6-month Solomon Island campaign to destroy the Japanese air arm, so to speak.
You mentioned how nasty the vegetation is at 100 meters. You know, send a group of soldiers 100 meters away and they're going to be at different locations. But the Japanese were moving miles through that thick jungle undergrowth to stage those attacks. Have you ever gotten back in there and retraced that? I mean, they were moving mortars and artillery pieces packed up through that, correct?
Yeah, they attempted to. The October attack, it was a good plan they had, but the Murayama Trail, Murayama was the 2nd Division commander's general. They named the Murayama Trail, Murayama Road. It was more of a trail. They were going to cut 15 miles through the thick jungle, and their plan worked. I mean, they were supposed to go away from Allied air cover and the local scouts, and, you know, they didn't pick them up. But they underestimated the terrain. The Japanese really underestimated the terrain of Guadalcanal. And I haven't walked the full track or trail. I've walked from one end to end from one end for a few miles and from the other end a few miles. And it's a killer.
15
and
miles.
They took their heavy artillery, and it was 75 millimeter pack howitzer. They broke them down. Each Japanese soldier was given a 175 millimeter round to put in his pack. And you can imagine what happened to those. And to this day, you could walk what's the remnants of the trail, and you can still find 75s into the bush. And they ended up dumping most of their heavy gear. And when they got ready for the assault, I think they only had like 2 or 3 infantry howitzers there. They had even carrying those top 96 heavy machine guns. That would kick their butt through the thick jungle. And they had ropes and stuff. They'd get to thick cliffs. They had to lower them down, and they were only given, I think, 3 days of food. These were fresh troops, and the attack kept getting delayed. And it took them 5 days to get through there. And by the time they reached the Marine lines, they were so already depleted anyway. Then they had to make a full-on assault against, defensive positions. I know the Battle of Bloody Ridge, it basically said, once you get through there, they're out of food. They said, well, eat the Marines' food. And which in the other campaigns, that's what happened, with the Dutch and then, and the Brits and Malaya and Indians and Australians. A lot of times they'd overrun all and Americans in the Philippines. They'd overrun a lot of these supply depots. So they relied on the Allies supplying them. But yeah, that jungle is pretty thick, pretty bad.
We can't forget to ask you about the stretcher parties.
Yes. Sorry. So it was a point with the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, just Chesty Puller's unit. And it was the first, the thing about the Puller's unit, the 7th Marines, they didn't go and get into Guadalcanal on 7th of August. What they did with the 7th Marines, that was one of 3 rifle regiments. So right when the war started, they fleshed out this regiment with some of the best NCOs, best officers, and they said, send them to Samoa, because at the time they thought the Japanese was going to keep pushing down. So then they garrisoned these islands. So they sent the 7th Marines, and with artillery battalion and a tank company, become a brigade. They sent some of the best guys in division there. So, and Puller was they kind of laughing and go, we're the first in, kind of ribbing the other guys. We're going to be the first to fight because we're fighting Samoa. And then when they got the word in 1 August that the rest of the division landed without them, they're stuck on Samoa. You can imagine how demotivated they were. They have like H.H. Hannikin, Basilone, Page, Puller, all of them were in that unit. But anyway, they got to come in September. As soon as Puller hit the ground, apparently he said, they handed him a map. No, he said, where's the Japanese? Typical Puller. Where's the Japanese? Just point me in the direction. And then handed him out. He goes, I can't make any sense of this. Just point me. And they said, he's that way. Like, okay. And to make a big showing. But the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, and the Raiders were some of the best units, and Vandergrift wanted to use them as their fire brigade, so to speak. So they're only there about a week. They sent the Raiders and the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines on reconnaissance in force toward the Matanicow River. So they sent Puller, his unit started out, and Puller being Puller, he was like the 4th man back in the line, leading the whole battalion. They were Indian file, so to speak, in single file. They had to move through. They were green unit and everything. And they came across some Japanese that was some of the rear guard from the Battle of Bloody Ridge. And they ran into him and got a bit of a firefight. And Puller's unit suffered some of the first casualties. So they dug in for the night. He's got on the radio and he said, look, we've got some casualties. I think they had 10 killed and 25 wounded. And they're about 3 miles from the perimeter near Henderson Field, and they're up in the ridge lines around Mount Austin. And he said, and Vandergrift said, well, I'll send you stretchers, and I'll send you 2nd Battalion of the 5th Marines. I'll send you another battalion up there. And at that time, they were only temporarily commanded by captain. Because I always wondered, because when they got up there, Puller took charge. And I said, what happened there? But I found out that a captain was the temporary command. So he took charge of the battalion. So he took 2 of his companies, A company, I keep calling them Alpha and Bravo, but people remind me, they're one called Alpha and Bravo. Okay. A and B company. You get what I'm saying?
Yes.
It's just old habits. But A and B company, he sent them back because the other battalion brought up stretchers. So they had a stretcher carry them out. They didn't have definitely any helicopters, and they couldn't get jeeps up there.
Sure.
Couldn't get boats. So you had to, old fashioned, had to hand carry them out. So they brought 25 stretchers up to get these guys out. I don't know if it was 25 stretcher, but he had 25 wounded. Some might have been walking wounded, but
Sure.
he had a number of stretcher cases. So he sent 2 whole companies back. So when I'm up in that area giving tours to people, I can find out very quickly who's ever carried a stretcher or not, because sometimes I get a question when I mention how it took almost 300 Marines to take back 25 wounded. And they went, geez, that's a lot. You only need 4 guys to a stretcher. And, and they were up there on the hills. You can actually see the airfield. It doesn't look that far away, but then you got, ridges, and you got jungles, and you got streams, and you got all this you got to go through, thick jungle. And whoever asked me that, I know for a fact they've never carried a stretcher or do a stretcher carry. It's like we was talking before. You could carry a stretcher under 100 meters of open football field, and it kicks your butt. And plus, you got to have security and things like that. And these guys, keep rotating off. But yeah, that's a terrain appreciation, so to speak.
Are there, to get back to the what it's like on the ground there, we were talking about Okinawa earlier and how it's just totally different. There's a city where a lot of the battlefields were. What's it like generally on Guadalcanal? Can you still kind of envision what the battlefield would have looked like? Is it grown up in areas like urban sprawl? Well,
the Point Cruz Matanical area, because after pre-war, it was coconut plantation and a little village. But then right after the campaign ended, Guadalcanal became a major logistical and training base. And the U.S. went in there and basically made a medium-sized city. And I read somewhere over 1 million Americans rotated through Guadalcanal by the end of the war. The 6th Marine Division was born on Guadalcanal. So, and when the Brits came back in, because they controlled the Solomon Islands beforehand, the pre-war government offices went to Tulagi, but when they came back, there was a ready-made city, so they moved in. So a lot of that battlefield's been built over. But Bloody Ridge, almost perfectly preserved. Alligator Creek is preserved. Unfortunately, there's some, they may be building some buildings there, but the best preserved battlefield is up on the Galloping Horse Ridges, which the movie The Thin Red Line, the book The Thin Red Line portrays.
Those were later fights, correct?
Yeah, the hill fights, they call them. If you look at my video, it's called Charles Davis Medal of Honor and the Thin Red Line. Looks just exactly. You could really, nothing's changed. I'm talking about terrain. There's one hut up there. Other than that, there's no Japanese there. It's about the only thing that's not there at the time. There might be still 1 or 2 up there somewhere, but yeah, that's probably the best preserved. And Tulagi's been built over. But if you go to Guadalcanal today, you can have a good edition of how it was. I mean, I used to do my battlefield study groups for the NCOs and officers would go to Bloody Ridge, because you could really see that terrain, and you put yourselves in the mind of the NCO, a platoon commander, company commander, and a battalion commander. It's a great little battlefield to study. But yeah, to answer your question, there's great places. And Bloody and up on the Galloping Horse Ridges, though, it's hard to access, and that's why you don't have much urban sprawl. But unfortunately, more and more people are moving in there, and that's why there's a major problem with UXOs right now and exploded ordnance, because more people are moving in, and the only place to actually expand is up on the ridges. So years ago, that ordinance hadn't been, disturbed. Now it's being disturbed. And also a lot of that's from the fighting, but I think a lot of it is from when it was field firing ranges, because I have all the range maps after the fighting. That became field firing ranges for all the guys training, because that's a major problem right now and of note to the community, because there's been a number of killed in the last couple of years. There was one not too long ago, last year, very tragic incident where just some young Solomon Islanders decided to have a cooking fire. These teenagers and young adults, and they cook around the fire, and the fire was on top of an unexploded 105 millimeter howitzer. And it high ordered, and unfortunately killed one and severely wounded the other ones. But that's what that's their biggest concern, obviously. But yeah,
Are the battlefields, are some of those battlefields preserved because they've not been accessed like you were getting at, or is there a deliberate effort to retain that area?
Yeah, it's a real good question. I mean, there's been a lot of good efforts through the years when, it's hard to gain traction. Bloody Ridge is the only one actually preserved. But in saying that, there's still squatters that go up there. They're from other islands like Malacca. They go and squat. The land rights in Solomon Islands is a bit different than in the Western world. The community owns it, so you don't have or traditional landowners, and people just squat on it. It's a national park, and they can just put a hut on it. It'd be like going to Gettysburg, and you go, I'll build a house on Gettysburg. Oh, really can't do that, but that's the only preserved battlefield. And once again, it's a third world country, and obviously you do have elements of corruption, even though you have say for example, War Relic Act. You're not supposed to export relics. I mean, I like relics myself, but when you go there, you're not supposed to take any relics away unless you have a permit from the National Museum and things like that. But that's probably the best preserved. And once again, as long as urban sprawl moves out, they won't preserve it. It was built over.
Sure.
There's no protection. We need the Civil War Trust over there, huh? Get those guys working.
Absolutely.
Well, it's like for them, life goes on, and like they weren't even involved, like the locals there weren't even involved with any of this either.
And that culture, they just live for the day, maybe live for the next day, but they're not thinking that far ahead. They go, oh, that's great. But what have you done for me today? What can you do for me tomorrow? Sure. The only thing I know of the war is you've left all this unexploded ordnance and it's killing our people. Oh, we saved you. You didn't save anyone. You didn't save me. They don't remember. They don't have that, and you can they see the monuments there. And, unfortunately, there's been a lot of defacing of monuments, not so much as they don't like the U.S. It's the monuments in the past have had brass and copper on there. They ripped the brass and copper off and melted down for money. It's third world country.
Sure.
Some of these veterans groups say, we'll put this plaque up. And, I always say, well, don't put a plaque that's going to be ripped down and used to get melted down. They don't do it to deface it. They just don't know. They just see people rock up there and look at this and take pictures and they go, what's this mean?
Yeah.
The poor kids, they're digging up relics to sell to the tourists. But what that does is, I've had a number of them walk up to me with a, Japanese knee boarder or frag and go, here, you want to buy this? No, I don't want to buy that. You just need to set that down and, try to discourage them from that. But, it's a third world, what do you do?
There's got to be a lot there. Ton of that, like you mentioned.
Yeah, it's
more than we could probably think. There's actually.
You can see my videos. Well, my videos, I come across, there's a frag there and a frag, Japanese hand grenade. There's knee mortar rounds and stuff. And that's the stuff on top of the ground. Yeah. So, heaps of stuff there.
Well, it's a bucket list for me, like I said. So when I eventually make that trip, maybe we'll do it for the podcast. What do you think, Sarah? Podcast trip to Guadalcanal, and we'll call Dave to get
if you reach out to it, yes.
It is very significant. Just think about it. I think we did talk about the size, like, and a lot of times with these islands, they seem like random islands in the middle of nowhere. It's not like they have resources. It's not like there was a big airfield there for them to kind of seize and then use as a foothold. It looks like it's of little value. And then when you think of like the sacrifice that it took to go into like straight up trench warfare, but yeah, true. But then, which was much individual sacrifice to get to that point. But then it's like big picture, what did it do? It did disrupt, it stopped this nation that's been offensively engaged for years and years, like successfully. And they did their job, right? That they did stop the force. They did to where the Japanese had to dedicate all of their resources and manpower to one little tiny, let's say, arbitrary island in the middle of the Pacific. But what it did was it pulled them from other directions. And that sort of stalemate or that sort of active defense seems like is exactly what they needed to do to then create all the future catalysts that happened from that point on, really.
Exactly. Because Yamamoto, the admiral, basically said, Guadalcanal, this is a fork in the road right now. The Americans have basically drew a line in the sand, in modern day speaking, in the war of attrition. And the Japanese couldn't fight a war of attrition. That's where we fought them there. 50,000 Japanese troops, 40 to 50,000 was put on Guadalcanal. There's different estimations. Some say 30 to 50, the lowest 30, some say as high as 50. Over roughly 20,000 died, about 9,000 died from disease and starvation. But those troops would have been pushed into Papua New Guinea, because Papua New Guinea was the primary objective, Port Moresby, of the Japanese. And then Guadalcanal, after the Battle of Bloody Ridge, the Japanese High Command met and said, look, to stop the offensive on the Dakota, right? Now our main objective will be Guadalcanal. We need to get these Americans out of Guadalcanal. Once we do that, we'll put Port Moresby as the main objective. But what that did was all those reinforcements that was going to go into Papua New Guinea went into Guadalcanal, but it allowed the Australians in to regroup, get their fresh guys over, and push back with Americans. But yeah, it was a major turning point, and the battle of attrition the Japanese couldn't compete with. Yeah.
It's awesome. Well, Dave, I hope we keep up with the videos and keep talking about this, because it is one of those battlefields that so few people are ever going to be able to experience. So just walking through the jungle and showing it is awesome. I don't think I said this earlier, but that's where I first came across your work. So our mutual friend Henry Sledge made the introduction, but I didn't realize I'd actually watched your videos in the past. So they're great. Keep them coming. I hope more and more people see them, and we'll definitely link them all here in the show.
And what you're doing, I mean, you're preserving it while it's still there. And that's like physically and then within living memory, because, Preston and I are still of the age where our grandparents' era. But as you know, we're approaching 40, and it's like, it's within living memory for us. That's separating, for one thing, just the people that were there and that connection. And then the physical terrain itself is going away. So what you are actively do is like a vital preservation of history.
Yeah, well, I figured, there's got to be some like minds like me out there that love the military history, and it's like when I walk you through, it's like me giving a tour to you, and I said, well, this is we need to preserve it and remember the men actually fought there. I can't say women. There's no women there. If it was, I would say men and women, but no, there was men that fought in Guadalcanal. We need to preserve their history, remember what they did. Yeah, it's a hard fight. Not in all their history. Yeah.
So if those like-minded people wanted to reach out to you, wanted to get a hold of you, where would they find you?
Well, the best is to go on my Facebook, the Guadalcanal Walking the Battlefield. It's the same title as my YouTube page, but they'll just send me a PM, or if they go on the YouTube, just send me a comment that, reach out, and I can get in contact with them, have people contact me all the time. That's the best way to do it.
Love it.
We can go from there.
That's great resource, personal, one-on-one communication. So, I mean, I'd say hook it up, take advantage of it.
Happy to help anyone, answer any questions, or just help them find a relative or whatever.
Awesome. Well, Dave, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. This was a lot of fun.
No, thank you guys for having me. It was a real pleasure and honor.
Absolutely. We'll talk soon.
All right.